Sparta sent 3 messengers to Athens in sequence. The first messenger invoked a religious curse aimed directly at Pericles. The second delivered a list of demands, and the third carried only one sentence: leave the Greeks free. Athens calls an assembly, and Pericles rises to explain why the only possible answer to all 3 is no. Last time, after Corinth threatened to leave the Peloponnesian League with Sparta, its leader did not act against Athenian pressure and expansion. Sparta finally voted that Athens had broken the peace treaty. This meant that Sparta would be bound to follow up on this verdict. But before an attack could come, there lay a final corridor of diplomacy that Sparta would take. They would send 3 messengers to Athens, each arriving in sequence, each carrying demands. But before we get to the demands themselves, it's worth addressing a question that historians have never quite settled. Did Sparta believe these 3 messengers with demands would actually work? Was there a genuine hope that the real ultimatum, framed the right way, might force Athens to back down? Or had the decision already been made so that the messengers were simply a diplomatic performance? So, was it a genuine attempt at keeping the peace, or a political move to create a strong case for war? I will leave you to decide what you think it was. Keep that question in mind as we walk through what the messengers actually said. The first messenger arrived with a demand that was not about the Treaty of Peace itself. Instead, the messenger mentioned a curse. Specifically, he invoked the curse of the goddess, an ancient religious stain attached to the family of the Alcmaeonids, one of Athens' most prominent aristocratic clans. Generations earlier, members of this family had been implicated in the killing of suppliants who had taken refuge at the sacred altar. The stain of that act, in the religious understanding of the time, had never been fully cleansed. It clung to the family, and to the city that harbored them, the Alcmaeonids. Specifically, Sparta's demand was that Athens should drive out this curse, expel those connected to it, cleanse the city of its guilt. This may sound to modern ears like theology, but it was politics. Because although this sounds like a vague demand, it was aimed at Pericles. Pericles was one of the most prominent and influential citizens of Athens. He was the son of Xanthippus, an influential politician and famous war hero of the Persian War. Thucydides named Pericles as the first citizen of the Athenian democracy, in effect the man running the show. Pericles' mother was an Alcmaeonid, so the demand was, at its core, a demand that Athens should expel Pericles. It was an attempt to decapitate Athenian leadership through religious procedure rather than by military force. But Athens saw through this demand. Their response, as Thucydides records it, was to point out that Sparta had its own religious sacrileges to answer for. The first messenger, therefore, went back to Sparta with the Athenian refusal. The second messenger arrived with a more conventional list of grievances. 3 demands. First, Athens was to lift the Megarian Decree. This was the sanctions that had excluded Megarian merchants from the ports of the Delian League and from the markets of Athens itself. So they demanded that the slow economic strangulation that the Megarians had described so devastatingly at the Spartan assembly were to be revoked. Secondly, Athens was to abandon the siege of Potidaea, the Corinthian colony that had revolted and was now being slowly starved into submission behind Athenian siege lines. And finally, Athens was to respect the autonomy of Aegina, a small island outside of Athens, whose relationship with Athens had long been contentious, and whose independence, Sparta argued, was being compromised by Athens. These demands were not chosen at random. Each one was a pressure point. The Megarian Decree was the grievance with the broadest resonance. It had been cited at the Spartan assembly as the clearest example of Athenian economic aggression, and lifting it would have amounted to a public Athenian admission that it had been wrong. Potidaea was where Corinthian volunteers were trapped behind siege walls, and abandoning the siege would have been a direct concession to Corinthian pressure. And Aegina touched Athenian pride in a different way. The island sat in waters Athens considered its own sphere of influence, and inside Athens, the demands produced genuine debate. Thucydides makes clear that the Megarian Decree in particular had its critics within the city. These critics argued that upholding a trade embargo against a minor city-state was not worth a war, and that the costs of the embargo were disproportionate to whatever strategic benefit it provided. And this was not a fringe position. It had supporters, and they were not wrong in arguing that the embargo was a significant irritant for the Peloponnesians. But Pericles, already the dominant voice in the assembly, argued that the specific demands mattered less than what agreeing to Spartan demands would mean. It was to tell Sparta, and every other power watching, that Athenian policy could be revised by threats. He reframed the question from whether the Megarian Decree was a wise policy or not, to whether Athens actually governed itself, or whether Sparta did. And the assembly, swayed by Pericles, refused the second messenger. So the messenger went back to Sparta with the Athenian refusal. Then the third messenger came. But this messenger carried no list of demands, just a single statement, brief enough to quote in full. Sparta wants the peace to continue, and there is no reason why it should not continue if you leave the Greeks free. It was, in its brevity, the most serious communication of all. The detailed demands of the second messenger had still contained the implicit suggestion that there was something to negotiate about, that adjustments could be made, that the gap between the two sides might be bridged by concession and counter-concession. The third embassy contained none of that. It was not an offer, it was a summary of a position that had hardened past the point of adjustment. Leave the Greeks free. Was this a formulation designed to be impossible for the Athenians to accept? The Delian League was, by definition, a network of cities that were not entirely free. The tribute-paying members of the Delian League, the allies who hosted Athenian garrisons and deferred to Athenian courts and contributed their ships to Athenian-led expeditions, none of them were free in the sense Sparta meant. To accept the demand was to dissolve the empire. Athens would never accept it. But in order to formulate an answer, the Athenians called an assembly. Thucydides described that many speakers came forward. The debate was real. Voices on both sides arguing the necessity of war or the wisdom of concessions. But Thucydides does not give us the speeches of those other voices. He gives us Pericles. He was the most powerful man in Athens, and now he rose to speak.
There is one principle, Athenians, which I hold to through everything, and that is the principle of no concessions to the Spartans. I know that the spirit which inspires men while they are being persuaded to make war is not always retained in action, that as circumstances change, resolutions change too. Yet I see that now as before, the same, almost literally the same counsel is demanded of me, And I want to challenge those of you who are allowing yourselves to be persuaded by the Spartans to support the national resolve, even in the case of setbacks, or you cannot claim credit in the event of success. For sometimes the course of things is as arbitrary as the plans of man. Indeed, this is why we usually blame chance for whatever does not happen as we expected. Now, it was clear before that Sparta plotted against us. It is even more clear now. The treaty provides that we shall mutually submit our differences to legal arbitration, and that we shall meanwhile keep what we have. Yet the Spartans never yet made us any offer of arbitration, and have not accepted such offers from us. On the contrary, they wish this to be settled by war instead of by negotiation. And now we find them here, skipping the requests and instead issuing demands. They order us to abandon the siege of Potidaea and let Aegina be independent, and to revoke the Megarian Decree. And now they conclude with an ultimatum warning us to leave the Greeks independent. I hope that none of you will think that we would be going to war for small matter if we refuse to revoke the Megarian Decree, which is their main complaint, and the revocation of which would keep the peace. Do not let any feeling of guilt linger in your minds as if you went to war for a small matter. This small matter contains the whole seal and trial of your resolution. If you give way, you will instantly have to meet some new demand, as having been frightened into obedience in the first instance, while a firm refusal will make them clearly understand that they must treat you more as equals. Make your decision, therefore, at once. Either act as they order you to before you are harmed, or, if we are to go to war, which I for one think we should, do so without caring whether the cost be great or small, and without making concessions or consenting to a precarious hold of our possessions. For all demands pressed on a neighbor as commands before any attempt at legal settlement, be they great or be they small, have only one meaning, and that is slavery. Now, as to the war and the resources available to each side, a detailed comparison will not show you the inferiority of Athens. Personally engaged in the cultivation of their land, without funds, either private or public, the Peloponnesians are farmers, without experience in long wars overseas. Their own poverty has always limited their conflicts with one another to short local attacks. A power like this is not capable of manning a fleet or frequently sending out armies. They cannot afford to be away from home, and besides, they have no command of the sea. Capital, it must be remembered, sustains a war more than forced contributions. Farmers are a class of men that are always more ready to serve in person rather than contributing their own funds. They are more confident that their bodies will survive the dangers of war compared to their funds, especially if the war lasts longer than they expect, which it almost certainly will. In a single battle, the Spartans and their allies may in principle be able to withstand the whole of Greece, but they are incapable of sustaining a war against a power whose character differs so fundamentally from their own. They lack a single unified council, which is needed for prompt and vigorous action. And furthermore, because every member of their league holds an equal vote, each pursues their own narrow interests, a situation that results in total inertia. The great wish of some of the members of their league is to get revenge on some particular enemy, while the great wish of the others is to not risk their own property. They rarely even assemble. But when they do, they only dedicate a very small fraction of the time to the consideration of any unified objective or goal, spending the rest of their time on their own private interests. Meanwhile, each member assumes that no harm will come of their neglect, believing it is the business of somebody else to look out for the future on their behalf. And so, because they all share in the same delusion, the common cause imperceptibly decays. But the main point is the hindrance that they will experience from the lack of money. The slowness with which they earn it will cause delay, but the opportunities of war wait for no one. Again, we need not be alarmed either at the possibility of them raising fortifications in Attica or at their navy. It would be difficult for the Spartans to build any system of fortifications to establish anything close to rival city. This is difficult enough even in time of peace, but much more difficult in enemy territory, especially when Athens is just as well fortified against them as they are against Athens. While a mere post might be able to do some harm to our countryside by incursions from their raiders and by our deserters, but this will never prevent us from sailing into their country and raising fortifications there, and making reprisals with our powerful fleet. For our naval skill is of more use to us for service on land than their military skill for service at sea. They will not find it easy to master the sea. Even we, who have been practicing since the Persian invasion, have yet to achieve perfection. So is there any chance of anything considerable being achieved by an agricultural, unseafaring population, who will besides be prevented from even practicing seafaring because of the blockade we will keep them under with our fleet? Against a small squadron of our fleet, they might be emboldened by their superior numbers and risk a battle, despite their ignorance. However, being pinned down by the full strength of our naval power will prevent them from moving, and through lack of practice, they will grow more clumsy and consequently more timid. It must be kept in mind that seamanship, just like anything else, is a matter of art. It cannot be taken up occasionally as an occupation for times of leisure. On the contrary, it is so demanding as to leave leisure for nothing else. Even if they were to steal the money from Olympia or Delphi, and try to seduce our foreign sailors by the temptation of higher pay, that would only be a serious danger if we could not still be a match for them by embarking our own citizens and foreigners resident among us. But in fact, we can always be a match for them in this way. And best of all, we have a larger and higher class of native sailors among our own citizens than all the rest of Greece combined. None of our foreign sailors would risk being exiled from their own country and taking service with the Spartans and their hopeless cause for the sake of a few days' high pay. This, I think, is a reasonably fair account of the position of the Spartans and their allies. But our situation is free from the defects that I have criticized in them, and has other advantages of its own, which the Spartans cannot match. If they march against our country, we will sail against theirs, and it will be found that the desolation of the whole of Attica cannot be compared with even a fraction of the Peloponnese, for they will not be able to replace it except by conquest, while we have plenty of land both on the islands and the continent. The rule of the sea is indeed of central importance. Consider for a moment that we were islanders. Can you conceive a more impregnable position? Well, this, in the future, should as far as possible be our understanding of our position. Let go of all thought of our land and houses. We must vigilantly guard the sea and the city. We must let no irritation that we may feel for the loss of our land and houses provoke us into a battle with the numerical superiority of the Spartans. Even a victory would only lead to another battle against the same superiority, but a defeat involves the loss of our allies too. Our allies are the source of our strength, and they will not remain quiet after we become unable to march against them. We must not despair over the loss of our land and houses, but over the loss of men's lives. It is men who give us these assets, but our assets give us no men. And if I thought that I could persuade you, I would have asked you to go out and lay waste to your possessions yourselves, just to show the Spartans that you will never submit to save your property. I have many other reasons to hope for a favorable result against the Spartans. Only if you can agree not to combine the conduct of this war with new conquests, and abstain from willfully involving yourselves in other dangers. Indeed, I am more afraid of our own blunders than of the enemy's devices. But these matters shall be explained in another speech, as events necessitate. But for the present, dismiss these messengers with the following answer. First, we will allow Megara to use our markets and harbors when the Spartans suspend their expulsion of us and our allies from theirs. Secondly, that we recognize the independence of the Greek cities if they were independent when we signed the treaty, and only if Sparta likewise grants to its own cities an independence that does not force them to serve Spartan interests, but allows them to be governed as they each separately may desire. Thirdly, that we are willing to accept arbitration as our agreements specify, and that we shall not commence hostilities, but shall resist those who do. This is an answer agreeable to the rights and the dignity of Athens. It must be thoroughly understood that war is now inevitable, but that the more readily we accept it, the less will be the eagerness of our opponents. And remember, it is out of the greatest dangers that both societies and individuals earn their greatest glory. Did our fathers not resist the Persians with resources far different from ours? And even when those resources had been abandoned, did they not resist more by wisdom than by fortune, more by daring than by strength, and so beat off the barbarians and advanced Athens to her present height? We must not fall short of their example. We must resist our enemies in any way and in every way possible, and make sure that we hand down our power to our posterity undiminished.
The Athenian assembly, yet again persuaded by Pericles, voted to send the messenger back with the response we just heard. The question before Athens was simple on its surface. Send the messengers home with a yes or a no. But Pericles understood that the real question ran deeper than that. His argument was this: Athens could not yield. Not on the Megarian Decree, not on Potidaea, not on anything. And not because these specific issues were worth a war. Indeed, these were unpopular with many Athenians too. But because they did not have the political capital to revise its policy. The moment Athens revised its policy under Spartan pressure, every ally in the Delian League would take note. Every tribute-paying city, every garrison, every member state that had calculated its own security on the assumption of Athenian resolve would draw the same conclusion, that Athens could be pushed, that its commitments were negotiable, that the empire, which rested not just on ships and money, but on the credibility of Athenian power. And once that was known, the cohesion of the League would begin to quietly dissolve. So even if the demands Sparta made to Athens could have been seen as reasonable, such as the Megarian Decree, relenting would in essence mean giving up its status as the master of the sea. So the answer was no. There was no other answer than no available to them, according to Pericles. But that raised another question. If Athens was going to war, which this refusal would inevitably lead to, how did it intend to win it? And Pericles said something that must have been hard for many Athenians to accept. Pericles did not promise victory. He promised survival, and asked Athens to trust that survival would eventually lead to victory. The strategy was deliberately defensive. Athens would not march its infantry out to face the Spartan army in open battle. That was a contest Athens could not win. When Sparta would invade Attica, as it surely would, Athens would pull its people back behind the long walls, let the countryside be ravaged, and wait. Meanwhile, the Athenian navy would raid the Peloponnesian coastlines, keep the tribute flowing, and slowly make the war more expensive for Sparta than Sparta could afford. It was clearly going to be a war of attrition. And Pericles was asking the Athenians to sign up for something genuinely hard. Years, possibly many years, of watching their own land get destroyed, while they sat behind walls and held their nerve. Now historians, Donald Kagan among them, have criticized this strategy by saying that you cannot win a war by not losing it. At some point, you must give your enemy a reason to stop. Pericles' strategy was too passive. It could prevent defeat, but it had no clear mechanism for forcing a victory. Sparta could also endure raids. It could absorb a stalemate. This plan was lacking something. What in Pericles' design would compel Sparta to sue for peace exactly? This is a fair point, but the same thing is true applied in reverse. Sparta could march into Attica every summer. It could burn every farm between Athens and the horizon, and it would still not lead to a victory. Sparta's army was the finest in the Greek world, and it was strategically irrelevant to the question of how to defeat a maritime empire. So neither side could deliver a knockout blow. That was not a flaw in Pericles' thinking. The question that would define this war was not how do we win, but who runs out of the will to fight and resolve to endure first. Pericles thought that Athens' treasury and fleet would give him reason to believe Sparta would exhaust itself before Athens did. The plan, stated simply, was to lose on land until Sparta couldn't win anymore due to the naval blockade it would put Sparta under. Now, Pericles was probably correct in his reading of the military situation, but it rested on something that Pericles did not, perhaps could not, spell out in the assembly that day. The Athenian plan required Athens to hold together, not just militarily, politically. Year after year of a war with no decisive engagements, no triumphant battles, no clear sign that the suffering was leading anywhere. That kind of war does not test armies, it tests institutions. It tests the patience of a democracy that could always choose to change course. It tests the willingness of ordinary people to keep sacrificing, keep suffering, and keep trusting strategy whose payoff remained long in the future. So the main challenge was how this strategy could be applied year after year without people losing patience. It demanded a very unified leadership. And this problem was, as Pericles said himself, he feared more the blunders of Athens than the power of Sparta. The real enemy of this war would not be Sparta. It would be the impatience of Athens. Next time, we will find out what happens after the third and last messenger was sent back to Sparta with the Athenian refusal and the beginning of war.